Have you ever wondered why the storm always feels louder at night? Why thunder, though natural, can sometimes sound like warning? Why, when floodwaters rise outside our homes, something deeper starts to rise inside us too? Quiet panic we don't quite know how to name? Today, the channel Bible Narrator will join you in walking through both the waters outside and the waters within. Because what's happening in Texas is no longer just a local weather event. It is, for many, a prophetic memento, living parable of fear, rescue, judgment, and faith. And as the highways turn into rivers and neighborhoods disappear beneath the muddy surface, one question begins to echo louder than the sirens. Has this happened before? You'll believe in God if you hear the whole story, because this isn't just about rain. It's about how the Bible has already spoken about this storm, and perhaps about the ones still to come. Before the storm, a land shaped by water, long before the concrete levees were raised and the 24-hour news cycle was born. Even before Spanish explorers first named this land, Texas was a product of water. Its story begins not with people, but with vast oceans and patient rivers, the forces that sculpted this landscape over millions of years. To understand the floods of today, we must first listen to the story whispered by the land itself, a tale of geological formation and sacred imprints. In the distant eons of geologic time, much of what is now Texas lay submerged beneath a warm, shallow inland sea known as the Western Interior Seaway. For millions of years, this ocean was a symphony of life and death. Tiny marine organisms, shells, and organic debris settled on the seabed, layer upon layer. The immense pressure of the water column above compressed these sediments, forging them into the thick beds of limestone and shale that now form the bedrock of much of the state. This was not merely a dry geological process, it was a primordial act of creation. The land of Texas was, quite literally, born of water. It is these same sedimentary layers, formed from an ancient aqueous world, that would create the Balcones Escarpment, dividing the arid hill country to the west from the fertile coastal plains to the east. As tectonic forces lifted the land and the sea receded, a new chapter of water began. The age of rivers, the Brazos, the Colorado, the Trinity, and the Rio Grande began their journeys. They flowed from the interior highlands to the Gulf of Mexico. They were not the gentle, channelized streams we see today. They were wild, untamed architects. A spring, snowmelt from the high country or heavy rains descended. These rivers would swell, transforming into ferocious torrents. They carried not just water, but millions of tons of silt, sand, and gravel. With every flood, they deposited a new layer of soil upon the coastal plains. This created some of the most fertile agricultural land in the world. The majestic canyons of West Texas, like Palo Duro Canyon, are not the result of a single event. They are the patient work of countless flash floods, each one carved a little deeper into the earth. In another light, this geological story echoes an older one, a story recorded not in stone, but in the first pages of the Bible. The book of Genesis opens with a formless, chaotic world where the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, Genesis 1-2. God's first creative act was to separate the waters from the waters, creating the sky, and then to gather the waters, to let the dry land appear. Water, in the biblical narrative, is both the source of life and the symbol of primordial chaos. The land of Texas, lifted from an ancient ocean and carved by mighty rivers, seems a physical testament to this sacred narrative. The limestone layers, filled with the fossils of sea creatures, are a reminder that life once flourished in the water. The fertile delta plains are evidence of the creative and life-giving power of floods. This sacred imprint is not just in the visual parallels, it lies in the idea of purpose and providence. While geology describes the what and the how, faith asks, why? Why was this land formed in this way? Was the fertility brought by the floods a preparation, a deliberate endowment for the generations who would come to inhabit it? The massive aquifers, like the Edwards Aquifer, formed by millions of years of water seeping through limestone, became the lifeblood for millions of people. They are sacred reservoirs, a legacy of the distant past, a testament to the providence of nature or of God. When the first human settlers arrived in Texas, they were drawn by these very gifts of water, the rivers for travel, the fertile soil for farming, and the lush grasslands for cattle. But they also learned a harsh lesson. The Creator could also be the destroyer. The same rivers that bestowed fertility would occasionally rage, reclaiming the floodplains they had built. The Native American inhabitants understood this rhythm. They built their settlements on higher ground, respecting the power of the river. But the newcomers, with a mindset of conquest and control, often built their towns and cities directly on the floodplains, defying the very forces that had created them. Thus, long before the first modern hurricane made landfall, a tension was set. It was a tension between the gift of water and its peril, between the providence of the Creator and the forgetfulness of humanity. The land of Texas, forged in the cataclysms of its geological past, carried within it a silent warning. Its very foundations were built on a memory of water, its power to create and its power to destroy. This is the context, the stage upon which all future floods would play out. Every storm, every rising tide, is not just a meteorological event. It is an echo from the deep past, a reminder of the true nature of this land and the laws, both natural and sacred, that govern it. Before there were storms named by men, there were the storms of the planet and of God. And they wrote the first chapter in the Epic of Texas, the floods that shook nations. Not all storms are local. Some carry the force to alter the course of history, searing themselves into the collective memory of a people and becoming parables retold across generations. They transcend meteorological reports and enter the realm of myth and theology. From the global deluge in the book of Genesis to the hurricane that leveled Galveston, these floods are more than natural disasters. They are moments of revelation, exposing the fragility of human civilization and raising profound questions about the relationship between God and humanity. The archetypal flood story, the one from which all others seem to flow, is that of Noah. As recorded in Genesis, it is a cosmic drama of creation, corruption, and recreation. The pre-flood world is described as filled with violence, Genesis 6:11, a place where human wickedness had grown so pervasive that it grieved God's heart. The flood was not a random act of a capricious deity. It is presented as a deliberate uncreation, a cleansing by water to wash away the corruption that had defiled his creation. It was an act of divine judgment, but it was not one without warning. Noah, described as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, received clear instructions. He was commanded to build a massive ark, an extraordinary feat of engineering that must have seemed like madness to his contemporaries. The decades-long construction of the ark was itself a visible warning, a silent sermon of the impending catastrophe. Human forgetfulness is a central theme in this story. While Noah labored, the world around him carried on eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, Matthew 24-38. Utterly unaware or indifferent to the warning, they had forgotten their Creator and his moral laws. Their complacency, their faith in the permanence of their world, was shattered by the rains that began to fall. When the flood came, It was a global event, a return to primordial chaos as all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Genesis 7:11. Yet even in the midst of this destruction, there was mercy. The ark, an island of life in an ocean of death, is a powerful symbol of God's saving grace. After the waters receded, God's first act was to establish a covenant symbolized by the rainbow, promising never again to destroy the earth with a flood. The Great Flood, therefore, is not just a story of judgment. It is a story of the discernment between good and evil, of salvation for those who listen, and of a divine promise of preservation thousands of years later, in a corner of the world unknown to the biblical authors. An eerily similar drama unfolded on the Texas coast. At the dawn of the 20th century, the city of Galveston was the jewel of the Gulf of Mexico. It was the largest city in Texas, a thriving hub of commerce and culture nicknamed the Wall Street of the Southwest and the Ellis Island of the West. With its magnificent Victorian architecture and a seemingly limitless future, Galveston exuded an air of confidence and pride. Its leaders, complacent in their prosperity, dismissed calls to build a seawall, believing a great hurricane could never strike their city. Isaac Klein, the local Weather Bureau chief, had even written an article declaring that the idea of a destructive hurricane hitting Galveston was an absurd delusion. This was a modern form of forgetting, not a forgetting of God, per se, but a forgetting of the power of nature, a hubris that believed human engineering and prosperity could subdue the elements. The warning came, not from a prophet, but from the darkening clouds and rising swell on the 8th of September. Ichenjobai, the Category 4 hurricane, made landfall with terrifying winds and a storm surge that no one had imagined possible. The Gulf rose over 15 feet, completely inundating an island that stood only a few feet above sea level. Houses were crushed into splinters. Sturdy buildings collapsed. Within hours, the proud city was obliterated. The flood shook the nation. An estimated says, 0 to 12. Null people died, making it the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. The destruction was total, a horrifying leveling reminiscent of the descriptions of the deluge. But, like the story of Noah, judgment was followed by a story of survival and rebirth. The survivors rose from the rubble with an iron will. They did the unthinkable. They raised the entire city. Hundreds of city blocks were jacked up, some by as much as 17 feet, and a massive, miles-long seawall was built. Galveston was reborn, rebuilt on a foundation of a new and painful respect for the power of the sea. When the stories of Noah and Galveston are placed side by side, a powerful pattern emerges. Both speak of a complacent world living in a state of forgetting one moral, the other natural. Both featured warnings that were ignored. Both experienced an apocalyptic flood, a judgment by water that swept away human pride. And both concluded with a form of recreation, a new beginning born from the catastrophe. The story of Galveston becomes a modern-day analog to the story of Noah, a reminder that even in an age of science and technology, humanity remains subject to forces far greater than itself. These floods that shake nations, whether ancient or modern, share a core message. Forgetfulness leads to disaster. But even in the most terrible destruction, the seeds of redemption and the promise of a new future can be found, the prophetic pattern of judgment and mercy. In the biblical worldview, natural events are rarely random. A drought that scorches the land, a plague of locusts that devours the harvest, or a flood that sweeps away cities, are not merely meteorological or ecological episodes. They are often viewed through a theological lens, understood as part of a larger rhythm, a repeating pattern of divine judgment and mercy. This pattern is not about an arbitrary, fickle God who rains down random disasters on humanity. Rather, it is an ordered system of moral cause and effect, a covenant-driven universe where human actions have tangible consequences, and God's intervention is both corrective and redemptive. The foundation for this pattern is laid in the Torah, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy. There, Moses presents the terms of the covenant to the Israelites before they enter the promised land. The terms are clear. Obedience to God's commands will bring blessings, while disobedience will bring curses. The blessings are described in images of fertility and harmony with nature. The Lord will open the heavens, the storehouse of his bounty, to send rain on your land in season. Deuteronomy 28:12. Life, prosperity, and ecological stability are directly linked to covenant faithfulness. Conversely, the curses are described in images of natural chaos, a breakdown of the created order. The Lord will turn the rain of your country into dust and powder. From the sky it will come down on you. Deuteronomy 28:23. -24. Floods, droughts, plagues, and famines are listed as the inevitable consequences of the nation turning away from God and his righteous ways, particularly the worship of idols and the oppression of the poor. This pattern action, obedience or disobedience, leading to consequence, blessing or curses, not just a theory. It becomes the lens through which Israel's historians and prophets interpreted their history. The books of Kings and Chronicles constantly return to this rhythm. A king did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and the kingdom prospered. Another king did evil, worshipped foreign gods, and allowed injustice to flourish. And disaster followed, often in the form of enemy invasion, likened to a flood or ecological catastrophe. This was not a mechanical formula, but a theological diagnosis of the nation's health. True worship and social justice were seen as the bedrock of national stability. Idolatry and oppression eroded that very foundation, leaving the nation vulnerable to collapse from within and attack from without. Yet, judgment is never the final word. It is always accompanied by an open door to mercy. The purpose of biblical judgment is not retributive destruction, but restorative discipline. It is like the pain of a necessary surgery to remove a growing cancer. Catastrophe, however painful, functions to awaken a people from their complacency and moral slumber. It forces them to confront the consequences of their choices and to recognize that they have lost their way. This is where mercy enters. After describing the terrible curses, Deuteronomy continues with a powerful promise. When all these things have happened to you, and you return to the Lord your God, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you. Deuteronomy 30:1-3. The call to teshuvah, Hebrew word meaning to return or repent, is always present. Even in the midst of judgment, the path back to God remains open. And when the people return, God promises not only to forgive but to restore. The covenant will be renewed, the land will be healed, and the blessings will flow once more. The story of Noah is again a perfect example. The judgment was the flood, but the mercy was the ark and the rainbow covenant. Israel's history is filled with such examples. The people sin. They are exiled to Babylon, a political and national flood. They repent in exile, and God, in his mercy, brings them back to their homeland to rebuild the temple. The full pattern is not just a two-part judgment-mercy sequence, but a five-step cycle. 1. Prosperity and the forgetting of God. 2. The warning of the prophets. 3. Judgment, often a catastrophe. 4. Repentance and crying out. And 5. Restoration by God's mercy. This rhythm profoundly shapes how Judeo-Christian thinkers understand the relationship between the natural and moral orders. It suggests that the universe is not an impersonal, neutral place. Human moral choices, how we treat one another, how we steward the Earth's resources, and our allegiance to the Creator have real, tangible effects. When a society becomes rife with greed, injustice, and pride, it weakens its own stability, like building a house on sand. The coming storm is not an arbitrary punishment, but the inevitable exposure of a weak foundation. Therefore, when floods sweep through Texas, this prophetic pattern offers an alternative interpretive framework. It invites us to look beyond the data on rainfall totals and river crests. It asks hard questions. Is our unchecked urban sprawl, paving over the natural floodplains, a form of hubris and a forgetting of the laws of nature? Is the fact that disasters always hit the poorest and most marginalized communities the hardest a sign of the social injustice the prophets condemned? The pattern doesn't offer easy answers, but it prevents us from writing off these disasters as mere bad luck. It suggests they can be a wake-up call, a painful opportunity to examine the foundations of our society. And most importantly, it affirms that even in the midst of devastation, the path to mercy, restoration, and a future built on a firmer foundation is always open to those who are willing to listen and to return. The voices in the storm, what the prophets saw. For the prophets of ancient Israel, the natural world was never silent. A roaring whirlwind, a raging river overflowing its banks, or a thunderstorm that shook the heavens were not just weather phenomena, they were carrier waves, living metaphors through which God spoke. The prophets possessed a unique ability to see and hear what others missed. They looked at a gathering storm and saw the advance of an invading army. They heard in the roar of a flash flood the voice of God's judgment against injustice. For them, storms and torrents were not meaningless chaos. They were coded messages, sermons of thunder and downpour. Amos, a shepherd from the southern kingdom of Judah, was sent to the wealthy northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE. He arrived in a society at the peak of its material prosperity but rotting from moral decay. The elite lived in luxurious houses of ivory while they oppressed the poor and crushed the needy. Amos 4:1. Amos used powerful imagery from the natural world to convey God's impending judgment. He declared, "The Lord roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem." Amos 1-2. This roar was not just a sound, it had the power to dry up pastures and wither the mountaintops. Amos described God's supreme power over the forces of nature. He is the one who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land. Amos 5-8. This prophecy was twofold. On one hand, it affirmed God as the creator who orchestrates the natural cycles. On the other, it carried a terrifying threat. The same God who could pour out seawater in a controlled way, as rain, could also do so destructively, as a tsunami or flood. For a society that had forgotten its creator, this image was a chilling reminder that the stability they took for granted was entirely dependent on his will. Isaiah, a prophet who ministered in Jerusalem during the rise of the brutal Assyrian Empire, masterfully used the imagery of flooding to describe both divine judgment and political threat. When King Ahaz of Judah sought an alliance with Assyria instead of trusting in God, Isaiah delivered a vivid prophecy. He said that because the people had rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah, symbolizing God's humble yet steady presence, God would therefore bring upon them the mighty and vast waters of the river, the Euphrates, the king of Assyria, and all his splendor. Isaiah 8-6-7. Isaiah envisioned the Assyrian army as an unstoppable flood that would sweep on into Judah, zwilling over it, passing through and reaching up to the neck. This is a work of imagistic genius. The flood was not a random event. It was the direct consequence of the nation's political and spiritual choice. They chose the power of empire over the protection of God, and now they would be drowned by the very power they invited. But it was also Isaiah who used water imagery to describe redemption and restoration in the later chapters of his book. Speaking of the return from exile, he paints a picture of a dry desert transformed into a lush oasis. For water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool. The thirsty ground bubbling springs. Isaiah 35:6-7. Here, water is a symbol of God's restorative grace, a divine healing that transforms a landscape of barren hopelessness into a place of life and abundance. Water, in Isaiah's vision, is two-sided. It can be the judgmental flood of Assyria or the life-giving springs of salvation. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet who lamented the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, used similar imagery. He saw waters rising in the north that would become a flooding torrent, overflowing the land and its cities. Jeremiah 47:2. For Jeremiah, the Babylonian army was a tidal wave of divine judgment, but even in his anguish, he clung to the hope of God's mercies, which were new every morning. Lamentations 3:23. In the New Testament, the Apostle John, in the book of Revelation, takes this imagery to a cosmic level. His vision of the end times is filled with symbolic storms, earthquakes, and floods. The sea, often a symbol of chaos and evil in Hebraic thought, plays a central role. He sees a beast coming out of the sea, Revelation 13:1, representing oppressive political power rising from the chaos of nations. He also describes divine judgments as bowls of wrath poured out on the earth, causing horrific plagues. Yet, John's final vision is not one of destruction. It is of a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth, in which there is a startling detail, and there was no longer any sea. Revelation 21:1. The absence of the sea is not an ecological statement. It is a powerful theological one. In God's remade world, the source of chaos, suffering, and evil will be utterly vanquished. Divine order will reign supreme. These prophetic voices form a mighty chorus across the centuries. They teach us that storms and torrents have a language. They speak of God's sovereignty over his creation. They speak of the consequences of human injustice and pride. They expose the fragility of the systems we build, but they also speak of the possibility of transformation, of a grace that can make the desert bloom. When a modern hurricane forms in the Gulf and bears down on the Texas coast, these ancient voices challenge us. They ask, do you see only a low-pressure system and wind speeds? Or can you also hear a message? Do you see in the rising waters a warning about our vulnerability? A call for justice for those who live on low-lying ground? An invitation to reflect on our relationship with this land and its creator? The prophets did not just look at the weather, they looked through it to the hand and voice of God, and they leave us with the question of whether we have the courage to do the same. Texas today, have we been listening? The sky turns a sickly gray, a color not found in nature's usual palette. The air is thick and heavy, ominously still before the fury begins. Then the first drops fall, not the gentle rain of a summer shower, but heavy bullets of water, striking rooftops and asphalt with a growing urgency. Soon they merge into an impenetrable curtain of water. Streets become rivers, creeks become roaring, brown torrents carrying branches, debris, and the broken pieces of ordinary life. The water rises with an alarming, inexorable speed. It seeps under doors, soaks through walls, and invades homes with a cold indifference. This is the tragically familiar scene of another Texas flood. a drama reenacted with increasing frequency and intensity in recent years, as rescue helicopters hover overhead and flat-bottomed boats navigate flooded neighborhoods. The initial, instinctive question is always, why is this happening? Science provides clear and necessary answers. Climate change is warming the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, fueling stronger, wetter storms. Relentless urban sprawl has replaced absorbent prairies and wetlands with impermeable surfaces of concrete and asphalt, giving the rainwater nowhere to go but up. These answers are true and vital, but as we stand before the devastation, before the reality that once-in-a-century floods now seem to happen every few years, a deeper, more unsettling question begins to surface. It is no longer, why is this happening? But, haven't we heard this before? The story of modern Texas is inseparable from the echoes of the past we have explored. Consider Part 1, a land shaped by water. We saw that Texas was born of water and sculpted by floods. The coastal plains, where great cities like Houston now sit, were created by millennia of riverine sediment deposits. They are natural floodplains. When we pave over these lands, build vast subdivisions in watersheds, and assume that concrete channels can tame the forces of nature, are we not engaging in a form of systemic amnesia? We have forgotten the lesson written into the very geology of the land. Water will always seek its home. Today's flood is, in a sense, the Earth's rebellion, a forceful reminder of its true nature, an assertion that the laws of hydrology cannot be indefinitely ignored. Consider the echo from Part 2, the floods that shook nations. The city of Galveston, in 1900, complacent in its prosperity and convinced of its own invulnerability, ignored the warnings and refused to build a seawall. They paid a terrible price for their hubris. Today, when we see urban planners continue to permit construction in high-risk areas, or when scientific warnings about sea level rise and stronger storms are brushed aside for short-term economic gain, are we not repeating Galveston's mistake on a grander scale? Hurricane Harvey in 2017 drowned Houston, a global economic hub, revealing the fragility of modern infrastructure against the power of a storm that stalled and unleashed an unimaginable volume of rain. Was this our generation's Galveston moment? A shocking wake-up call forcing us to confront our own complacency. Next, listen to the rhythm of Part 3, the prophetic pattern of judgment and mercy. The prophets linked natural disaster to moral failure, especially social injustice. In the floods of modern Texas, who suffers the most? It is invariably communities of color, immigrants, and low-income families. Their homes are often located on low-lying, less valuable land, less protected by flood control infrastructure. They have fewer resources with which to evacuate and even fewer with which to recover. When the floodwaters recede, leaving behind toxic sludge and mold, it is these communities that face the longest-term health and economic burdens. Is the rising floodwater, which cruelly highlights the lines of inequality, a modern form of judgment on our societal sins? It is not punishment from an angry God, but the inevitable exposure of a fractured system where the prosperity of some is built on the vulnerability of others. Finally, recall Part 4. The voices in the storm. The prophets looked at storms and saw divine messages. What is the message for us today? Perhaps it is a call to humility. In an age of technology and seeming control, a great flood reminds us that we are not the masters of the universe. There are forces far greater than ourselves. Perhaps it is a call to accountability. The intensifying storms are a clear message about the consequences of our stewardship of the planet. Perhaps it is a call to compassion. The images of neighbors rescuing neighbors in small boats, the Cajun Navy during Hurricane Harvey, revealed extraordinary kindness and sacrifice. In the midst of judgment, there is always mercy, not only from above, but from human to human. So, have we been listening? The question is not meant to inspire fear or a simple indictment. It is an invitation to profound reflection. The story of Texas, from its geology to its theology, suggests that these floods are more than natural disasters. They are moments of truth, moments when the foundations of our society are tested and its cracks are exposed. They are the echoes of Noah, of Galveston, of Isaiah. As the water recedes and the long work of cleanup and rebuilding begins, the choice is ours. We can simply rebuild what was there, patch up the old levees, and wait for the next storm, stuck in a cycle of forgetfulness and disaster. Or we can pause, we can listen, we can learn from the stories written in the stone, in history, and in scripture. We can choose to rebuild differently, more wisely, more justly, more humbly. We can design our cities in harmony with nature instead of in opposition to it. We can prioritize the protection of the most vulnerable. We can recognize that true prosperity lies not in storm-defying skyscrapers, but in a community that is resilient, equitable, and attentive to the warnings. Whether they come from climate scientists or from the echoes of ancient prophets, the next storm will surely come. The question is no longer why, but what will we do next? Will we continue to plug our ears to a story told time and again? Or will we finally listen and change our course? The answer will determine the future of Texas, and it will be written either in the mud or on a more solid foundation.